Rightio, welcome everybody to the Farming Forecaster Outlook and Strategic Grazing for a Bobtail Spring webinar. My name is Paul Simpson. I'm with Local Land Services based out of Albury and in that extension advisory space for mixed farming. So just to get things underway, I'd like to introduce our other presenters today, Nick O'Connor, who's a Senior Land Services Officer with Local Land Services based out to Niliquin, and Nick's going to be running us through some of the farming forecaster sites that are in the west. And we've got Matt Lischke from Southeast Local Land Services, who's going to do some presentation on some case studies and also about some of the grazing and fodder options for what might be ahead of us with the spring growth. So today's bit of an overview of what's going on, a couple of housekeeping points so to navigate your way around the screen. Then I'll just do a quick refresher of Farming Forecaster, what the pasture graphs represent, just to clarify that. It's always a little bit confusing for some people. Then Matt Lischke is going to jump in with some case study comparisons of a couple of different years. And Nick and myself will cover a bit of an overview. And then Matt's going to come back in and talk about some strategic grazing to make the most of the spring and some scenarios there. The key outcomes I'm hoping that some or all of you folks might get out of today is a little bit familiar with the current conditions as they look as reported from interpreted from the Farming Forecaster sites, putting the El Nino noise into perspective, and Matt Lischke's going to provide some insights to that, and also some grazing or fodder options to consider for your location and perhaps how you might be able to use Farming Forecaster to make some decisions. So first of all, just a little bit of housekeeping. You'll notice hopefully at the top of your bar, if you're on a desktop or laptop, you should see this ribbon of icons up here. The two key ones for yourself, if you want to put in a question or make a comment, there's the chat icon, which is this one here. And when you toggle that, the right-hand side of your screen should come up with a box, and you can put your comment in there. Later on, when we do a bit of Q&A, if you want to ask a question, hit this button here, that your hand will come up and we can just organize ourselves around the questions and answers. At that point, Nick and myself might undo the mic box here so people can join the discussion and the conversation. So hopefully that's reasonably clear, and you'll be able to navigate your way around there. The first thing I wanted to check in with is the pasture plots that you see when you dial in or log on to the Farming Forecaster site. Now, I'm presuming that some people or most people are familiar with Farming Forecaster and might have even had a play around with it and have a look as well. So when you get onto a particular site, this is what you generally see in terms of the pasture plot. I've got these coloured shaded bits here, and we've got these coloured lines, and obviously from the key you can sort of see what the lines might represent. I just want to go through quickly what each of these shading parts and those individual lines represent, just so we're all on the same page. So in this plot there's background shading, the different coloured lines, and a short black line which is sitting just here. So let's get rid of most of those other lines and just look at the shading and the short black line. So these shaded areas are the predicted green pasture at this site, and this is Mundaroo up near Tumbarumba, using the past 30 years of climate data, and it divides it into groups or percentiles. So there's three shaded sections. So the green section, this bit right up the very top here, as you would expect, it's the modelled pasture showing the top 15 years from 50% to 90%. So if you were sitting in this, you're above average years right up to just short of the very best years, and that's the information that's presented. The orange bit in the middle here, and hopefully the colours are coming through at your end, it's the modelled pasture growth for the middle part of the the data. So the 30 years data is run through the model, and this is the result for this site. And the red, it's for the worst 25% or close to the 25% of the bottom years. It doesn't actually do the bottom 1 to 3 years because it would probably just be 0 in a lot of cases and not provide much information. So that's what these sections represent. So at the very top of the orange line is what we would refer to maybe as an average year. So this plot is generated and stays pretty much the same for the whole season. It's just this window that we're looking at the moment. Each year this changes as the 30-year data set changes, but it doesn't change that much. Now, the short black line, which is this little one here, it's the pasture growth using this year's climate data. And this is rerun each day, I think that's right, Matt. And it's using the current climate data for this area and showing you what the grass grow model, the CSIRO grass grow model, is predicting here. So at the moment, for this side, it's looking at about just above 1,500 kilograms of material. And as the title here says, this is green herbage. It doesn't account for dead or standing material, and that's something that's going to be coming into this in a little while, into this program. So if we put in some of these lines that we had before, this red line here, it's predicting based on this starting point for this. This is where we are at the moment, and it's saying, okay, if we use the bottom section of that 30 years of data, the less favourable years, this is what we think might happen. And that's the green pasture production there. So that's the lowest 4 to 6 years. It doesn't include the lowest 1 to 3 because, as I said, they'd probably show 0. So the advantage of this shaded area is gives you an opportunity to compare what's either currently happening, like this black line at the moment is sitting above that 90% historical shading area. So that's fairly encouraging. And obviously the red line here, it dips. Even if the conditions are really poor, it stays in that area for a little while, but then it gradually drops off. Now, if we were to look at what might be the average conditions for the remainder or for the next couple of months, the yellow line here, so it's using those middle years of the 30 years of data, and it's suggesting here that it'll continue to track reasonably well in that 50 to 90% bracket, and it doesn't really tend to drop off or change too much until we get to middle of October there. And just to be a little bit optimistic, but I haven't gone overboard, just using the 75% line here, suggesting that if we have above average conditions, by comparison, it's sitting pretty much where it would in that shaded block there. So that's a bit of a refresher on how the plots look and what the shaded areas are. And I think I shall hand over to Matt now to kick off with a bit of a case study.
Thanks. Thanks, Paul. Hopefully that's coming through okay there now.
Yep, that's good.
So I just thought I'd step everyone through a case study from 2023, and you may have heard this before if you've tuned into previous webinars, so apologies if this is a double up or a repeat for you. But 2023 was a really interesting year because what we've experienced, I think, this year is there's a lot of parallels between 2026 and 2023. And if you cast your mind back to 2023, like this year, we've had a lot of commentary around a developing El Nino, and in 23, like this year, that commentary started off in autumn and continued to build momentum through the year. And as 2023 progressed, producers were quite concerned about where the season might go. And in late August in 2023, these maps were released by the Bureau, and these were the maps for the September and October forecasts, which we can see were looking quite negative, with a lot of that brown shading across the map, which is actually quite similar to the forecast for September and October this year. October is probably not quite as negative as what it was in 23, but certainly September forecast at the moment is looking very similar to what we were looking at in 23. So you might remember in 23, when these maps came out, a lot of people then put stock onto the market and started destocking. And no doubt you remember that the stock market started to really take a very hard dive, and there were a lot of stocks sold for very little money, unfortunately. So the market certainly reacted to that oversupply. But it was quite interesting at that point in time in the southeast that we were seeing quite big differences across the region in terms of soil moisture and risk profile. And we're seeing that exactly the same scenario play out this year in our part of the world, because I'm based in Goulburn. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to show you 3 locations, one being Burrawa, Goulburn and Braidwood. And I'll start with Burrawa in that top left-hand corner. So in 2023, I've got some screenshots here, and I was fortunate enough, I guess, at the time to take these screenshots because we don't have a repository on the website, and this is off Farming Forecaster. But on the left-hand side, you can see there that the soil probe readings at the start of September in 2023 for Burrawa were looking really good. We can see there that we've got soil moisture readings, all sitting well up above 80%. So basically going into spring in 2023 with almost a full profile of soil moisture to depth. And what the corresponding pasture forecast said in 23 for this site was that because we'd had a good winter in terms of pasture growth and a full profile of moisture, the pasture forecast was indicating that, this was our starting point, very, very high up on the edge of the green, that 90th percentile sort of territory. And then if we look at those projection lines, even if we were to follow the red line, which is the really dry scenario, we can see that our spring peak pasture yield was going to be up here, which is well above the long-term average. So despite that quite negative forecast from the Bureau, people sitting in the Burrawa region and quite a few areas around Burrawa were actually sitting in a very strong position heading to spring. And there was no need in that area to panic and sell stock, because basically they were guaranteed to get a spring. We'll now go about 100 kilometres to Goulburn, so a bit further east. And Goulburn recorded much less rainfall for winter in 23. So you can see there that we have a much drier looking soil profile, particularly at depth, compared to Burrawa. So coming out of winter in 23, much drier soil profile. And we can see that the pasture forecast, even though we were coming out of winter with really good amounts of green feed, but we can see that there's a huge variation in those projection lines. And what it was indicating was that if things were to turn extremely dry and follow that red line, that pastures would quickly hay off, which is pretty much exactly what happened. The Goulburn region actually followed that red line. And so the season cut out very short and early. But even so, what it was showing us, because of our strong starting position, if we look along, historically speaking, if we draw a line through there, it wasn't a disaster. We were still had a decent amount of green feed in the paddock, which was then going to transfer into the dead pool, and still provide us a reasonable amount of carryover feed going forward. So not panic stations, but certainly a well below average spring for Goulburn. The third site in this case study is Braidwood. So we're going further east again, a dry winter as well, so even drier than Goulburn, which is what we're seeing this year again. And as you can see, the probe readings coming out of winter were much different, looking very dry for Goulburn. And if we look at the pasture forecast, our starting position was also quite different. So now we're down, starting off in red territory, so in the bottom 25% of years. And what the pasture forecast was indicating was that if the below average spring rainfall were to eventuate, which is actually what happened, we can see that this red line just quickly dives away. But it was coming off quite a low base to start with. So what this was showing was for Braidwood, quite a high risk of a failed spring, which is what happened. So it's just interesting in reflection that we had the one forecast came out, but 3 different locations with very, very different looking risk profiles heading into spring. So I think it's really important to, when, at the moment, looking at where soil moisture is sitting, and then having a look at those pasture forecast graphs, because what the pasture forecast graphs do is they actually take into account, unlike a weather forecast, they actually take into account what your starting position is in terms of soil moisture. It takes into account how much green feed you have in the paddock, and then it overlays local climate data for your location and gives you a localized risk profile based on all of those factors. So what are the chances of actually getting a spring? And as I mentioned, achieving a spring is really a function of feed in the paddock, soil moisture, and then your rainfall. So unlike a long-range forecast, the pasture forecast takes all of those 3 aspects into account, enables us to assess the odds, i.e. what's our risk profile for spring. So just before we step through a couple of examples from the Murray region, one of the ways that when we get to this time of the year is we can really use the pasture forecast, those historical shaded areas, as Paul referred to earlier, to really get some sort of sense of, are we on track to get a spring or not? And really, in southern Australia, the main objective in spring is to get some sort of spring. And the idea there is that if we get a reasonable spring, that gives us enough carryover dead feed to then get us through a fair way into summer, gives us ground cover, it provides ground cover, and it also gives us some dry standing feed that we can utilise over that summer and into autumn period. If we get a really hard bobtail spring, what tends to happen is stock tend to still perform okay, particularly in that early part of spring when things cut out really quickly, because that residual feed is still of high quality. But the catch is, as we move closer to Christmas, depending on how hard spring's been, ground cover can start to become an issue, and our feeding costs go up as well. So we just want to get a reasonable spring to give us something to work with going forward. So if we look at where the black tracking line is, we can actually then say, okay, well, if this black tracking line gets up and gets somewhere near the intersection between the orange zone and the green zone, if this gets up to sort of this sort of territory, what it's telling us is that based on history, we are getting up towards, we've achieved an average spring. for that region. So that's a big tick. If the black tracking worm is more forecast to sort of be in this territory or below, then what it's indicating is essentially it's in the bottom 25% of years, and you could describe that as a failed spring, okay, which is really what we want to avoid. But if it is looking like we are facing that sort of a situation, at least the pasture forecast is giving us a bit of a heads up that's a likely outcome, and if that's the case, then we can start to prepare and plan for it. Rightio, I think that's over to you, Nick.
Unmute myself would be a good start. Thanks, Matt. I'm just going to do a quick run around some of the Western pasture forecasts. I'll jump through a few of them reasonably quickly, so if there's any questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A or hold on to them, and we'll be happy to bring up a couple of these graphs towards the end again. To start with, I thought I'd pull up the regional map from the Farming Forecaster website. So this map is available on Farming Forecaster, and it shows all of our probes across Murray, so the local land services and Holbrook Landcare probes. As you can see, there's about 19 there. Eastern half soil profiles are reasonably full, up near 100% at most of them. The western half, some are quite full and some are been drawn down quite a bit from such active pasture growth through a reasonably mild winter. Anyone looking along looking on their own computer or likely to have a bit of a look later, I encourage you to have a bit of a look at this map. You can actually click on each site and it'll show you the name and the soil moisture at different depths. Those soil moisture figures are from the actual probe data, so that's the real soil moisture data at that site. And there's also that little drop-down menu there where you can toggle between rainfall and soil moisture, and you can see the rainfall at each site for previous weeks, months and the year to date. Moving along, I thought I'd start in the far west of the region. So Dilparra is our furthest western site. It's just north of the Murray River, near Swan Hill there, for anyone unfamiliar. Essentially, the Farming Forecaster website, when you have a look, is broken down into two components for each site. The pasture forecast information and the weather station and probe data. So what I've put up here is two screenshots of the Dilparra pasture forecast information. So if you're looking at the Farming Forecaster website and you click on a site and you go into more pasture detail, some of these two screenshots are what you'll see there. So looking on the right hand side there, that is the modelled plant available soil water, which is used in the pasture forecasting. So it doesn't actually use the probe data, it uses this modelled system, and it's just a typical box and whisker plot. I've probably chosen not the best one there because it's you can't see the bottom half of it, but the red dot there shows where the soil moisture currently sits compared to historic years. So that red dot there is above the top of the box, which is the 75th percentile, and below that top line, which is the 90th percentile. So you'd probably say that's about 80%, which is getting drawn into this Dilparra pasture forecast. And more importantly, the screenshot on the left there shows the enterprise and environmental conditions that go into the farm system model. And that's probably the most important thing to look at when looking at a pasture forecast on Farming Forecaster, to know the context of that site and what's involved in that model. So for Dilparra, we can see it's a 600 kilo self-replacing herd of cattle at 2.3 DSE to the hectare, grazing annual grasses, meadows and summer grasses. So if we look at the Dilpara pasture forecast, we can see the black tracking line up above that green shading. So as Paul described, that's indicating that currently and through July and into August, conditions have been very good at Dilpara, above sort of 90% of the last 30 years. We can see a little drop there in early August, which could be explained from a little bit cooler temperatures and the odd frost that we had leading up to that recent rainfall, and then a little climb again in that black line between August 1 and August 16 since that rainfall last weekend. Looking at the forecasts lines here, I've just kept the ones that automatically come up, which is the 10, 50 and 90 percentile. Looking at the 10 percentile, which is essentially, you know, your worst year in 10, your very poor conditions, we can see that sort of as of right now and into late August, we're at that spring peak. We can see that it drops away, but it is staying in the sort of green shading through till the end of September, but essentially dropping away until then. The 50 percentile line, which is sort of your median year, we can see that peak continues up a little bit through till late August to the start of September, and it stays above that 90th percentile of historic data before also dropping down as moisture runs out. And of course the 90th percentile line, which is the blue line, which is perfect conditions, best case scenario, we can see that we stay above the 90% shading. So essentially a bumper year out at Dilpara through till early October if moisture keeps up and rainfall keeps up. Moving on to Mathiara, so I've just pulled in some of the information that's available that goes into the farm system modelling. So Mathiara run trade cattle at 6 DSE to the hectare, so a bit heavier than, a bit higher stocking rate than Dilpara, and it's on sown annual grasses and vetch, so essentially it's a grazing oats and vetch out at Mathiara. Looking at that black line again, we can see that it's been a very good few months out there, and that'll be reflected in those grazing crops out there. In the white through July and early August, above the 90% percentile line of historic data. Again, looking at the red and yellow lines, we can see that we're very much nearing the spring peak if conditions are to drop off. However, following that red line down, we can see that we pretty much stay in the green shading all the way through, even if the rainfall cuts out now, which is represented out there in those grazing crops, that they're essentially quite thick and they're successful crops at this stage. However, with the blue line, similar to Dilpara, we can see if rainfall keeps up that Mathiara is in for a very, very good season, above sort of a 1 in 10 season, if not better. I'll keep moving on quickly.
Can I just make if you just go back, Nick, I might just make a point. Just with those, just to explain, those, you can see that the lines are dropping away, particularly on the red and the yellow case there. When you see the lines dropping away, and you can see the drop in historical shading as well, it's important to remember that that's not indicating that we're running out of feed. That's just when those lines start to bend over and drop, that is just indicating that the pastures are starting to go from green to dead. So this is just a graph showing the green component in the paddock. We don't have a graph on the website at the moment which shows the dead feed. But if we did have a dead feed graph, as those lines drop away in that current graph for green, the dead feed is going up, because basically the green feed is senescing or haying off and then being transferred to the dead pool. So don't be alarmed by the fact that those lines are dropping away, because that's just indicating that shift from green to dead is occurring. What we're really focusing on is where those projection lines peak out, and where they peak, the height of the peak relative to history. And we can see that the red line is folding over sort of around late August, but the peak is well up into that green territory, which means your spring peak yield is well above the long-term average. So it's looking very positive going forward.
Thanks, Matt. I'll keep moving on and pull up the Wanganella site. So I've included Wanganella as you can see, the soil moisture has been drawn down a bit further at Wanganella, which is a result of such active pasture growth with such a sort of warm and wet winter so far. So Wanganella is a 70 kilogram self-replacing merino flock at 1.1 DSE to the hectare on annual grasses, medics and summer natives in this model. So as Matt sort of explained there, we're and looking at the black tracking line, we're right up in the top of the green there currently. If conditions are to cut out and we're to experience sort of a bottom 10 percentile year, we're essentially at that peak now and in through sort of late August, before the growth starts to turn, like Matt said. And we can see a bit of variability here with looking at the yellow tracking line, which is your sort of median projection, with that peak sort of happening through to the start of September and right up there at the 80th sort of percentile of historic data. And of course, if wet conditions persist, we can see that blue line tracking up above the 90th percentile of historic data. One thing to bear in mind with Wanganella and any of the other rangeland sites are to look at the context of what pasture species are in the model. Obviously, browsing of shrubs like saltbush and other bushes is common on the rangelands, and that's not captured in this model. It's simply annual grasses, medics and summer natives. Moving on to Corowa. I've just included Corowa as it looks a bit different to a lot of the other sites. As you can see, there's a full soil moisture profile there, and the black tracking line's been through the green shading up until recently, which is evident of a sort of mild winter. Looking at the little comment at the top there, so this is a 70 kilo ewe flock producing prime lambs at pretty heavy stocking rate, grazing on lucerne and ryegrass. So that's the key essentially to understanding what this graph is showing us. With a mild winter, the lucerne growth has been reasonable. What we can see is that drop into the orange there with the frost and the cooler conditions, and then a bit of a slump with all three projections through late August and early September. That's explained essentially by a bit of a waterlogging effect in the model of the lucerne, just a bit of a wet feet sort of effect. As you can see in the red and yellow lines, that recovery goes through sort of September into October. But if moisture's to cut out and poor conditions occur through spring, the recovery of that lucerne is sort of cut short, and those peaks are quite low in that red and yellow shading if the moisture cuts out once the lucerne recovers from that waterlogging effect. Alternatively, looking at sort of best case scenario, if it remains wet and as the days get a bit longer and warmer, that lucerne will recover from that waterlogging effect and take off and sort of just stay in that green shading there. So this Corowa prediction at the minute really highlights the importance of looking at what the models are actually modelling and what the pasture species are. Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think that sums up what's happening in the West at the minute. If any questions on those graphs, keep them in mind and we can have a look at them towards the end.
Thanks, Nick. Moving a little bit east in the Murray region here, we've got a few sites just for reference here down in the bottom. If you can see my cursor there, can you see that, Nick? Yep, is Albury's here. And a couple of the sites we're going to look at here is the Little Billabong site just north and east of Holbrook a little bit. And this site here, which is the Mundaroo site. So starting off at the Mundaroo site, and the enterprise here is a 500 kilo composite cow, and they're running a pretty solid stocking rate. I think it's about 17.5 DSE per hectare, and quite a bit of elevation here. This site sits up about 650 metres, but the rainfall is about 950 mil. So pretty promising conditions there, but as you expect with that elevation comes some cold and frosty conditions. So this is basically a shot of the information from Mundaroo, which is about 30 k's south of Tumbarumba. And as you can see, the soil probe at the site is showing a fairly healthy measure of moisture in the site there, and the projected pasture here is looking reasonable at the moment. You'll notice the black line here is actually sitting above the 90% level, so it's looking pretty good at the moment. And as Nick explained, depending on whether you're getting a good, medium, or excellent year, what we're looking at here for green herbage material is we're starting off, we've got a massive bulk of material at the moment, and that continues even with poor conditions and dry conditions all the way through to around that mid-October, and that peak is basically hitting the average year, even with average, below average rainfall and climate conditions. And as Matt's emphasised, you need to factor in here that you've got standing material that is going to be not represented here as the grass hays off. So we're looking at a fairly solid mass of herbage here. Same with the average, the 50 percentile or the median years there. That's looking pretty healthy. And I've just used this 75% one again, as opposed to the blue line that Nick used. And that's showing a fairly healthy stock as well. So and Matt will talk a little bit more about this, but some of the considerations for these sites is what are you going to do with all that grass, and what might your options be, and how can you manage your pastures to perhaps extend that green growth as far into spring as you can, with what annual grasses might be there and what perennial ones might be there. So as Nick emphasised, one of the things you need to consider is the results here are based on the enterprise location and rainfall for those sites. So you might just, in your local area where the probes might be, just factor that into it, whether you're running your stock harder or a bit lighter. You might want to factor that in, but as a general rule, it'll be a relative comparison. So these lines will still follow the same general trend, but you might not be getting the same production if you're a less intense producer and you're not putting on as much fertilizer, etc. So just bear in mind that it has been set up for that particular site. So the black plot, as I said, it's looking still pretty tidy. And just another reminder that this is the green pasture growth. And this was the site last Friday, and it had about just over 1,000 kilos of dry matter on the ground. And remembering that about 4 centimetres of growth on this clover and phalaris, about 4 centimetres is getting you around that 1,200 kilograms of dry matter. And some of the other paddocks around there were well in excess of that and probably pushing 3,000. And they'd been ones that have been locked up and strategically grazed. And so things aren't looking too bad for Mundaroo at the moment. And as Nick indicated, we've got the box plot of the modelled soil moisture. This is using the climate data. And what it's showing here is that the soil profile from the model information is showing it's pushing up towards that top end of the long-term averages. So that's sort of, it's just another way of checking what you're seeing in the paddock with the probes at the site versus the long-term trends and averages as well, just so you can put that in perspective and help your decision making. Moving a little bit back towards Holbrook and dropping down off the hills a little bit, we're into at 700 mil rainfall here, and we're looking at self-replacing composite U flock here, and they're running at 13 DSE, so still pretty hot there. Now this site, this is one of the Holbrook Land Care Network sites, and Nick might have some comments on that if he needs to, but these sites were put in some time back. They don't have the same level of a number of sensors in the profile, but still giving us a pretty good indication of what's going on there at those at that site. If we move on a little bit to look at the pasture production itself, at the moment, obviously, the black plot, which is based on the current situation to date, it's looking fairly healthy, and it's probably sitting in that between 50 and 90%. It's probably sitting in the middle, so we're looking at about that 75%. So reasonably solid production in pastures to date. And if you drive around that area, you'll see that, but you'll also see some that's been grazed down a bit, depending on what management they've used there. So if conditions stay average, the yellow, that suggests it'll stay above your average year long term, and it might drop into that, but then it'll still push a bit into that favourable 50 to 90% favourable years there. And as Nick said, with poor conditions here, it starts to demonstrate running out a bit of moisture, but also just senescing as some of those pastures dry off, and the clover starts to mature and go to seed. And obviously, if it's a bumper season and the blue line there, the top 10% or top percentile of years, you'll get a pretty good outcome there. So the issue with these sites might be more around what are you going to do with the bulk of material you've got? How do you manage that? Particularly looking ahead, and one of the farmers I was talking to on the near the Underoo site was mentioning that, you know, he might have to start thinking about what management in terms of fire threat and stuff like that. And this is a pasture measurement from that site, showing about 1,600, 1,700 kilos, and that's sort of representative of what we're seeing there, and it's also what we're seeing on the plot here at the moment. So what we're seeing on the plot for this site is pretty much what we're seeing in the paddock. So a little bit of ground truthing, pardon me, that I did then as well. I think I might throw back to you. Just the red box plot on there. It's showing that site is a little bit drier than the long term, but it's only marginally different there. And I do wonder whether it's only just a little bit different to that long-term situation for this time of year. And I think that might pull me up there, Matt, so I might throw back to you, and we can push on.
No worries. All right, so just to finish off, a couple of slides here looking at pasture management this spring. So looking at those pasture forecasts, I mean, generally speaking, the Murray region is sitting in a very strong position as we move further towards spring, and really location and timing and amount of rainfall this spring is really going to determine the net result and how big your spring ends up being. So if you are in one of those locations where even the red line is getting up quite high on those graphs, and you're really on track for an average or well above average spring, it could be an opportunity this year to do some fodder conservation and perhaps replenish hay and silage reserves that have been depleted in recent years. So even though grass might seem free, when you have these better years, there is actually a lot of dollars tied up in fodder conservation. So I think the word of caution there is careful planning is really important. And if you are, really planning on doing some hay and silage production, good preparation is important, but also thinking through what the end purpose will be. And what I mean by that is the fodder going to be used? What's the fodder going to be used for? Are you looking at more of a short-term situation, or are you putting hay or silage away for long-term drought sort of preparation further down the track? If you're going to go long-term, then obviously it needs to be protected from the weather, damage from pests and the like. And so, because otherwise you can spend a lot of money in making hay or silage, and then you go to use it down the track and high degree of spoilage and wastage. And over the years, I've seen a lot of individually wrapped bales of silage put in paddocks, and they just sit there for years and years, and the plastic deteriorates, it gets damaged by birds and pests, and you end up just with a lot of expensive garden mulch that goes to waste. So I think it's really important to think that through of what that end use is going to be, and do it well. I think the other thing to note is that paddocks that are cut for hay or silage, they end up being really good paddocks often for young stock, due to that lock-up phase and that rest period. So good paddocks to wean for young stock, for weaners. And then if you end up getting any sort of summer rainfall down the track, they can also be quite good paddocks that will respond, because you've removed that pasture out of the system and opened things up. If the pasture species are there that can respond to summer rain, then you do pick up those benefits as well.
Matt, I just wondered, did you want to mention that webinar or session that River's going to present on?
Yeah, so if people are thinking about whether they go down the hay or silage sort of track, Riverina LLS are running a webinar coming up with Neil Griffiths. So Neil's a bit of a guru in the hay and silage space, and I think that's the 31st of August that webinar has been run. So we might be able to send some details around afterwards, Paul. So fodder conservation is one option. Grazing management, a couple of things here, and I think the one thing that we know is that from past experiences, often when we have these bigger type of springs, pastures do tend to get away from us, and we do tend to grow a lot of feed, but the quality is often down. And so as a result, livestock performance is often not as good as we expect when we have these bigger springs. So in really good springs, you can't manage everything. So generally, the general advice is to concentrate your areas or your focus on a couple of paddocks that you can keep under some sort of control, and use grazing pressure to try and keep a lid on those pastures as best you can, and keep those pastures in check, so to speak. So you're just really trying to, as I said, keep a bit of a lid on pastures, not letting them just go whoosh and get out of control where you lose quality, but using sort of grazing pressure as spring progresses, just to ratchet up your mouths per hectare, and try and really hold on to that quality, and push quality as far as you can into spring. And one of the strategies can be is for sheep producers, if you are lambing in winter, particularly late winter, is around landmarking time. Combining mobs together and putting them back out on and dropping paddocks out of the system, so that you can actually ratchet up your grazing pressure as temperatures increase and pasture growth rate increases. So you're really focusing on a couple of key paddocks that you can really try and control. The others are going to get away, but you can come back and graze those paddocks that get away over summer and work away there. In contrast, if we're dealing with a bobtail spring, and this is probably more referring to some of those sites where perhaps the red line, if things really do turn dry, maybe it is going to be a well below average spring. I don't think there's any sites that we looked at where we're looking at a failed spring, but perhaps, if rainfall really does cut out, then maybe it is going to be a well below average type spring. And if you are in that category, again, it's really about using grazing pressure to really try and conserve moisture and keep pastures vegetative for as long as possible. And so what paddocks might you target? Well, I think that, you're probably looking around your property and thinking, okay, well, if spring is likely to cut out a bit early, generally we look at targeting paddocks that just from history just tend to hang on for longer into spring. So they do tend to be paddocks that are a bit lower lying paddocks in the landscape. Paddocks that just have better soil depth, better, and you just know from the past that those paddocks do tend to stay greener for longer into spring. So the other thing to look at would be a good density of perennial species. If we're trying to use mouths to keep pastures short and push quality longer and keep things greener for longer into spring, perennial species, if you've got them in the mix, you're going to have more control over that with grazing pressure than annuals. So annuals, they're really geared up to set seed, and you've probably seen some annual grasses starting to put seed heads up already. So we don't really have a lot of control through grazing on pushing those annuals further into spring. So if you've got pastures with Phalaris, cocksfoot, those sort of perennial type fescues, those sort of perennial species, they're the ones that you have a much greater ability to actually keep vegetative through grazing and really push them as far as you can through spring. And the third factor there would also be paddocks with good fertiliser and lime history. We just know from experience and through research that paddocks with good soil nutrient levels and good and they had a bit of lime, so pHs and acid isn't as much of a restriction, that those pasture species, those plants will have stronger root systems, and they'll be able to extract more moisture to depth and hang on a bit longer as well. I guess more looking further ahead, if you are in that situation where spring is looking a bit tight, just keep an eye on ground cover. I think you'll find that the bit of feed that you do generate in spring, once it does dry off, that will actually maintain quite good levels of quality, and I think you'll be surprised at how well stock do perform on that carryover feed. But the downside is you will come to a point where ground cover, depending on what happens over summer, could get quite thin, and so just keep an eye on ground cover levels and confinement feeding, which has really become quite commonplace in the last sort of 20 to 25 years. It's a great way to get stock off country once you start to get down to those minimum sort of thresholds for ground cover. And the general rule of thumb that we sort of talk to for ground cover is 70%. So getting stock off country, if you are sort of getting down to those minimum ground cover thresholds. And the final point there would be and this is not just for confinement feeding, but for just general feeding over summer, is really, I'd encourage people to take the guesswork out of feeding. And what I mean by that is condition scoring or fat scoring, whatever method you use, but visually or manually assess your condition of your sheep and cattle, your breeding females, because that really does help fine tune your feeding amounts, and also get a feed test done. So local land services, we have free feed test kits available at the moment, and we just see huge variations in energy and protein between feeds. So the free test is there, it's available. If you don't have the numbers, you really are guessing, and because of that big variation that we see in energy and protein levels, if you don't have the numbers, you can actually be a fair way out in your feeding amounts, and that can be quite costly over the long term. So get a feed test done, and also check your feeding rates. So once you have the numbers, there are some really good calculators, feeding tables and things out there, which you can plug those numbers into, and it's really energy is the main number that you're looking at. But you can use those numbers, plug them into those calculators or those lookup tables, and it just really helps to fine tune the amount that you're putting out, which can make a huge difference, particularly in the long term, between maintaining stock in adequate condition for joining and the like, or potentially losing condition over time and then running into issues down the track. Rightio, that's all I think, Paul.
Thanks, Matt. And just on the feed calculators and all that sort of stuff, if you need any assistance with any of that, myself and Nick are available. But also thinking a little bit ahead, we have 4 weeks out from Henty. The local land services will be there in the local land services shed. So if you want to get up to speed on any of this stuff, people like Nick and I will be there from the ag team in the Murray, and we can run you through some of these things and do a bit of demos, and also have some resources there to help you out. At that time of year, hopefully you've still got heaps of feed in the paddock, but come into summer and late summer, early autumn, you might need a bit of our help with that, but we're always here to help you would do some of those calculations. I've just put up there the actual site for Farming Forecast. It's pretty simple. You do a search on Farming Forecaster in any of those search engines, you'll find it. Have a navigation around there. If you do have any troubles finding stuff on there, once again, myself or Nick O'Connor are available to have a chat about that and talk you through some of the bits and pieces. And I just wanted to check in with Nick McGrath from Holbrook Landcare. Nick, is there anything you wanted to say about what your observations are around Holbrook at the moment and how things are looking?
I think you covered it pretty good, Paul. Like that little billabong probe, the moisture levels are a bit lower than what other probes in the region are saying. So I'll look into that. They have had decent rain there, so just might need to tweak some things there. But other than that, that's all good from me. I did have a question though, Paul, for you, like yourself or Matt or Nick. With the forecast, the climate forecast, what's it using at the moment? Like previously, we used to have 2 options there for the BOM and then one other one. But do you know what it's using at the moment?
Matt, that might be one for you because that's changed in the last 6 months.
Yeah, so good question, Nick, and good pick up. So originally we had the pasture forecast as it currently stands, where we have the projection lines are based on climatology, which is historical data. And then for a period there, we were also able to get the Access S, which is the BOM's forecasting model, and grab the forecast data and run that through GrassGrow as well, and produce the pasture forecast. So we used to have a pasture forecast a toggle switch on the website where you could look at the forecast based on climatology, which is what you're currently seeing, which is historical data. And then you used to be able to hit a button called Access S, which gave you the same pasture forecast, but through the lens of what the BOM were predicting for the next, 3 months. We've had some changes with how that back end data is processed, and it used to be all done through CSIRO, but now the company that built the website called Square V, which are based in Victoria, Square V now do all the pasture modelling for us through on their servers in Bendigo. And so because we had to move away from CSIRO doing that work, it meant that our agreement to get the data off BOM, we lost that agreement because it was sort of through CSIRO. Long story short, because of that change in processing and CSIRO dropping out, we then came to a point where we had to, like, BOM were going to charge us 30 grand to continue to have that Access S data. So farming forecasters are non-for-profit entity, and they just don't have the budget to spend 30 grand every year to get hold of the Access S data to run the other version of the pasture forecast. So it's a little bit of a shame, but I guess we're back to where we were originally. The pasture forecast is based on historical data. And so what you do is that, I guess how you approach it is you look at those forecast projection lines, and then you look at the BOM forecast, and you say, well, based on what the BOM are forecasting for the next 2, maybe 3 out to 3 months, which line are we most likely to follow, based on what BOM's saying.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. And there is a way to look into those forecasts, which we might try and deal with on another time. I'm just mindful of the time. I'm just interested. There was a couple of questions, Matt. Colin asked, is there any plan to include the shrub and other bush grazing at all in this particular model?
I'm assuming that question's for locations out west.
Out west, yeah.
Yeah. It's a good question. I know that so Phil Graham, who's done a lot of the majority of the grass grow modelling for us, he's been working with Riverina LLS, and they've got a site out at Hay. So if you go onto the Riverina website and have a look at the Hay site, just have a look at the grass grow assumptions there. I'm pretty sure they are modelling saltbush and things at that Hay site. So
okay,
it would be worth having a look at what Hay's doing with the modelling, and if that model looks fairly applicable for your area, then it might be it could be just a matter of picking that model up and bringing it across to the Murray in those further western areas.
Sounds good. Thanks, Matt. Any other questions? I know a couple of people put them in the Q&A. Sally, I shall.
Oh, Sally's online.
Yeah. Hi, Matt. I'll just clarify that we've been doing a bit of work at the One Tree site at Sandra and Matt Ison's property, and yeah, still a fair bit to go on the shrub side of things, but that work has been continuing on. Yeah, just trying to get the modelling right. It is difficult. It's not an easy thing to do. So, Colin, have a look at One Tree, the Yarrabee One Tree. Probably more that site than the Mungadale one, which is the Hay one.
Thanks, Sally.
That's okay.
I didn't see you online there, so if I had seen you there, I would have went straight to you. But thank you.
No, that's okay. That's fine. It's only just started. The work's only just started, Matt. It's it's only been in the last few weeks, really.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
No worries. Great.
Matt, I might add. Sorry, Paul. Colin's question had 2 parts there. He also asked about dry matter feed and total feed on offer, and whether that's going to be introduced at all to the forecasts?
Yeah, so good question, and the answer is yes. So there are some website upgrades which are in the pipeline at the moment, and one of the upgrades will be to include a dead feed or a dead pasture graph as well. So yes, down the track we'll have a graph, the current graph for green, and also one for dead. So you'll get the full picture.
Great.
Thanks, Nick. If there are no further questions, I just remind you that Nick and I are both available for assistance there, but also the Southern Drought Hub based out of CSU. There's drought adoption officers who operate out there across the Riverina and the Murray, and I'll send those details along with the information for the Riverina silage and hay webinar in a couple of weeks. And there will be a recording of this webinar available not too far down the track if you want to review it, or you know someone who missed it and would like to look at it. But no further questions. I might end the webinar, and Matt and Nick will stay around and have a quick chat.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks all.
If I stop the recording, Paul.
So I'll just hit end the event.